There is a book sitting quietly on a shelf somewhere that has changed more lives than most people will ever know. It was written over 100 years ago by a man who grew up with almost nothing, who faced failure so many times that most people would have simply stopped trying. And yet, he sat down and wrote something so powerful, so deeply true, that it still reaches through time and grabs you by the collar today. That book is Pushing to the Front by Orison Swett Marden. And if you have ever felt stuck, if you have ever looked at your life and thought, is this really all there is, then what you are about to hear might just be the thing that changes everything for you. Let me tell you something about Orison Swett Marden before we go any further, because his story itself is the whole point. He was not born into privilege. He was not handed opportunities on a silver platter. His mother died when he was just a small child, and his father passed away shortly after, leaving him an orphan at a very young age. He was passed around from family to family, working as a farm boy, doing whatever it took just to survive. Nobody looked at little Orison and said, "That boy is going to change the world." Nobody saw greatness in him, and yet deep inside that young boy, something was burning, something quiet but persistent, a belief that life could be more, that he could be more. He read every book he could get his hands on. He worked during the day and studied at night. He put himself through school, then through college, then through law school, and then through medical school. Yes, you heard that right. The same man. Multiple degrees, multiple careers, multiple failures along the way, including watching an entire hotel he had built burn to the ground, losing nearly everything he had worked for. And what did he do? He started over. He sat down in the ruins of his old life, and he wrote. He wrote the book that became Pushing to the Front, and that book went on to sell millions of copies and inspire people like Theodore Roosevelt, who called it one of the most important books he had ever read. So when this man tells you that success is possible for ordinary people, he is not saying it from a comfortable armchair with no idea what struggle feels like. He is saying it from the trenches. He earned every word on every page. Now let us talk about what this book actually teaches, because it is not just a collection of nice phrases. It is a deeply practical, deeply human roadmap for turning a life of limitation into a life of meaning and achievement. And the first thing Marden wants you to understand, the very foundation that everything else is built on, is this. Your environment does not determine your destiny. Your circumstances do not decide your outcome. You do. We live in a world where it is very easy to point outward, to say, I was not given the same chances. I did not grow up in the right family. I did not go to the right school. I do not have the right connections. And Marden looks at all of that and says, yes, and so what? Because the history of human achievement is absolutely overflowing with people who had every reason to fail and chose not to. People who were told no and kept walking forward anyway. People who were handed nothing and built something remarkable out of sheer will and persistence and hunger. He talks about a young man who grew up in extreme poverty, who had no formal education to speak of, who spent his early years doing back-breaking manual labor just to keep food on the table. Every single person around him had accepted their lot in life. They had decided, this is where we come from, and so this is where we stay. But this young man refused that story. He read everything he could find. He observed people who were successful and studied how they thought, how they carried themselves, how they spent their time. He asked questions that his peers thought were foolish. He dreamed in directions that made his neighbors laugh. And slowly, painfully, with more setbacks than most people ever face, he built a life that became extraordinary. Not because the world handed it to him, because he refused to stop pushing forward. That is the title of the book after all, Pushing to the Front, not coasting to the front, not being handed the front, pushing. And that word choice is deliberate, because Marden understood something very important about the nature of success. It is not a passive experience. It does not arrive because you are waiting for it. It requires active, relentless, daily movement in the direction of what you want. Even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. One of the most powerful ideas in this book is the concept of the power of purpose. Marden argues with tremendous conviction that the single biggest difference between people who succeed and people who do not is not talent, not intelligence, not family background, not luck. It is purpose. It is knowing what you are for, Having a clear, burning sense of direction that guides every decision, every action, every morning when you wake up and have to decide how you are going to spend your time and energy. Think about the people you know who seem to have an almost magnetic quality, who seem to move through the world with a kind of certainty and energy that others lack. There is a very good chance that what you are responding to is purpose. They know where they are going, and that knowledge changes everything. It changes how they handle setbacks, because setbacks are just temporary obstacles on the way to a known destination. It changes how they spend their time, because they are not just filling hours, they are building towards something. It changes how other people respond to them, because there is something deeply compelling about someone who knows what they want and is committed to getting there. Marden tells the story of a young woman who was working a dead-end job in a factory, doing repetitive work that gave her no satisfaction, earning just enough to get by. On the surface, her situation looked like the kind of thing that traps people, but she had a purpose. She had decided, with clarity and fire, that she was going to become a great writer. Not a decent writer, a great one. And so every single morning, before the factory, she wrote. Every single evening after the factory, she wrote. She read voraciously. She studied the craft with the same intensity that a surgeon studies medicine. She submitted her work and had it rejected over and over by editors who said it was not good enough. And she kept going, because her purpose was not a casual wish. It was a deep-rooted commitment that nothing could shake. Years later, her work was not only published, it was celebrated. People who had no idea what her early years looked like assumed she was one of the lucky ones. They had no idea about the mornings and the evenings and the rejections and the factory and the years of invisible effort. They only saw the result, and that is almost always how it works. We see other people's success, and we miss all the pushing that happened before we started paying attention. Now here is something that Marden wants to address directly, because it is one of the most common mental traps that keeps people stuck. The idea that you need to wait until conditions are perfect, until you have more money, until your kids are older, until you finish that course, until the economy improves, until you feel ready. And Marden says quite plainly that you will wait forever if you wait for perfect conditions. Because perfect conditions are a myth. They do not exist, and the people who are actually building remarkable lives are not waiting for perfect conditions. They are working with imperfect ones. They are moving forward with what they have, where they are, right now. There is a beautiful concept in this book about the power of beginning. Just beginning. Not having everything figured out. Not having a complete map. Not having all the resources you will eventually need. Just taking the first step with whatever you have in your hands today. Because beginning creates momentum. Beginning opens doors that sitting still never can. Beginning tells the universe, and more importantly tells yourself, that you are serious. That this is not just a dream you are attached to but never acting on. It is a direction you are actually moving in. Marden writes about a man who wanted to start a business but had almost no capital. Every person he talked to told him to wait, save more money first, get more experience, find a partner who already has the resources. And this man listened to that advice for 2 years. 2 years of waiting. 2 years of watching his dreams sit still while his life kept moving. And then one day, something shifted in him. He stopped waiting and started doing. He started with what little he had. He made every mistake in the book. He had weeks where he was not sure he could keep going, but he kept moving, kept adjusting, kept learning from every stumble. And within 5 years, he had built something that the people who told him to wait could barely believe. Not because he was smarter than them, not because he was luckier. Because he started. That story, in different forms, shows up all through this book. And the reason Marden keeps coming back to it is because he knows how powerful the pull of inaction is. He knows how comfortable it is to stay in the world of intentions and plans and someday. Because in that world, you never fail. Your dream is still perfect, still untouched, still theoretically possible. The moment you start, you risk failure. You risk discovering that it is harder than you thought. You risk looking foolish. And that risk is exactly why most people never start. And exactly why the ones who do start end up in a completely different place. Let us talk about the idea of self-reliance, because this is one of the most recurring and insistent themes in pushing to the front. Marden has an almost fierce love for the concept of standing on your own feet, of developing your own capacities, of not leaning on others to do what you are capable of doing yourself. He is not saying that asking for help is wrong. He is saying something deeper and more important, that you must not hand over the responsibility for your own life to anyone else. Not your employer, not your government, not your family, not circumstances. The responsibility for your life belongs to you. And the moment you truly internalize that, the moment you stop looking for someone else to rescue you or blame for your situation, everything changes. He talks about the danger of dependency, of what happens to a person's spirit and capability when they spend too long relying on external support instead of developing their own inner resources. It is like a muscle. If you never use it, it weakens. If you constantly have someone else carry the load for you, your own strength does not grow. And Marden believed, with everything in him, that the development of personal strength and capability is not just a practical matter. It is a deeply moral one. It is about becoming the fullest possible version of what you are capable of being. Now, this does not mean grinding yourself into the ground with no support and no rest. Marden is not preaching a kind of brutal, joyless self-reliance that ignores human connection and community. He's talking about something more like inner authority, the decision to be the primary architect of your own life, to have your own judgment, your own convictions, your own sense of direction that is not entirely dependent on what the people around you think or say or do. There is a story he tells about two brothers who grew up in the same family, in the same house, with the same opportunities, or lack of them. They were as similar as two people can be in terms of starting conditions. And yet, 20 years later, their lives were almost unrecognizable from each other. One brother had built a stable, meaningful, financially successful life. The other was still struggling, still blaming circumstances, still waiting for a break that never seemed to come. What was the difference? The first brother had decided early on that he was responsible for his life. He had made peace with the fact that no one was coming to save him, and that this was actually good news, because it meant he had the power. The second brother had spent 2 decades waiting for the world to be more fair, for someone to recognize his potential and give him his due. He was still waiting. This is not a comfortable story. It is not supposed to be. Marden writes with a kind of loving directness that can sting a little, because he respects his readers too much to coddle them. He wants you to actually change your life, not just feel good for an hour before going back to the same habits and patterns. And real change requires honest self-examination. It requires looking at the places where you have been giving your power away and deciding to take it back. One of the chapters that genuinely stops you in your tracks is the section on concentration, on the power of focused attention. Marden is absolutely convinced that one of the most significant differences between ordinary results and extraordinary results is the ability to concentrate fully on one thing, not to divide your attention across 10 projects, 10 goals, 10 interests, but to pour yourself completely and wholeheartedly into one thing at a time. He observed that the most successful people he studied were not necessarily the most talented or the most educated, but they were almost universally the ones who could focus, who could sit with a problem or a task and give it their complete attention, undistracted, for extended periods of time. He watched people with tremendous natural gifts accomplish very little because their attention was scattered across too many directions. And he watched people with modest natural gifts accomplish remarkable things because they had mastered the art of concentration. Think about what this means in the world we live in today. We are surrounded by more distractions than any previous generation in human history. Our phones are designed to fragment our attention. Social media is engineered to pull us away from what we are doing every few minutes. The pace of modern life creates this constant sense that we should be doing multiple things at once, that focused, single-minded attention on one thing is somehow inefficient or even a luxury we cannot afford. And yet Marden would say, and the research of modern neuroscience would agree, that this fragmented, scattered way of living is one of the most devastating things we can do to our capacity for achievement. Because real progress, real mastery, real creation requires depth. And depth requires time and attention that is not constantly interrupted. It requires the willingness to say no to everything else for a period of time so that you can say yes completely to this one thing. And every time you sit down and do that, every time you choose depth over distraction, you are building something. You are building the habit and the capacity for focused work that will over time produce results that scattered, distracted effort simply cannot. Marden also writes beautifully and at length about the importance of enthusiasm, not the shallow, performative kind that shows up when things are going well and disappears the moment they get hard, but genuine, deep enthusiasm, the kind that is rooted in caring deeply about what you are doing, in finding meaning in your work, in feeling connected to something larger than just a paycheck or a title or someone else's approval. He talks about the almost magnetic quality that genuine enthusiasm produces, how it attracts other people, creates opportunities, and sustains effort through difficulties that would stop a person who is just going through the motions. He believed that you cannot really give your best to something you do not care about, that the energy required for genuine excellence can only come from a place of genuine engagement. And so the question of what you are enthusiastic about is not a soft, frivolous question. It is one of the most important practical questions you can ask yourself, because the answer tells you where your potential for excellence actually lies. He tells a story of a young engineer who was technically competent but not particularly remarkable. He did his work well enough, showed up reliably, produced acceptable results, but he had always been drawn, in his spare time, to the study of water systems. Not because anyone told him to, not because it was relevant to his job, but because he found it genuinely fascinating. He could spend hours reading about it, thinking about it, playing with ideas in his head, and over time, as he developed deep knowledge in this area driven purely by enthusiasm, he became one of the leading experts in the region on water infrastructure. His career transformed, not because he suddenly became a different person, because he started doing work he was deeply interested in, and let that enthusiasm drive his effort and his learning in ways that nothing else could have. This is something worth sitting with for a moment, because so many people make the mistake of thinking that enthusiasm will come after they have mastered something, or after they have found success in it. They are waiting to feel excited about their work, but Marden suggests that it often works the other way. You find what genuinely interests you, you commit to it, and the mastery and the success grow out of the enthusiasm rather than the other way around. Enthusiasm is not the reward for succeeding. It is often the fuel that makes success possible. Now let us spend some time with another major pillar of this book, which is the concept of character. Because Marden is absolutely unambiguous about this, you can have all the talent in the world, all the ambition, all the education, all the right connections, and still fail if your character is weak. Character is not just about being a good person in some abstract moral sense. It is about being reliable, being consistent, doing what you say you will do, maintaining your integrity even when it is costly or inconvenient to do so. He talks about the trust that is built, slowly and invisibly, through 1,000 small moments of keeping your word, of being where you said you would be, of doing the work you said you would do, of being honest when dishonesty would be easier. And he talks about the trust that is destroyed just as invisibly and just as powerfully through 1,000 small moments of the opposite. Small compromises, small excuses, small failures to follow through. Most people think about character in terms of the big moments, the dramatic choices where the right path and the wrong path are clearly visible. But Marden understands that character is really built and destroyed in the small moments, the moments when no one is watching and there is no obvious consequence for taking the easy way out. The moments when you could tell a small lie that would make things simpler. The moments when you could deliver 70% effort instead of 100% and probably get away with it. What you do in those moments, over and over, across years and decades, is what determines your character. And your character, in turn, determines the kind of life you are capable of building. He writes about a business owner who had a reputation in his community for absolute reliability. If he told you a thing would be done, it was done. If he told you a price, that was the price. If he made a mistake, he owned it, fixed it, and made it right, without being asked and without excuses. And over the years, this reputation became one of his most valuable assets. People sought him out specifically because they trusted him. Other businesses referred customers to him. Opportunities came to him that never came to people with comparable or even superior technical skills simply because his character made people feel safe working with him. This is something that Marden comes back to repeatedly because he saw it play out over and over in the lives he studied. Talent can get you in the door, but character determines how long you stay and how high you rise. And in a world where so many people are looking for shortcuts and ways to manage perceptions rather than actually being trustworthy, the person who simply does what they say every time stands out in a way that no marketing or self-promotion can replicate. Connected to this is Marden's discussion of honesty and his conviction that honesty is not just a moral virtue but a practical one. He believed that dishonesty, even when it seems to work in the short term, almost always catches up with a person. That the energy required to maintain deception is a constant drain, that the trust destroyed by dishonesty is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild, and that the person who commits to radical honesty even when it is uncomfortable ends up with a simpler, lighter, more powerful life, because they do not have to remember what story they told to which person, because people around them know what they are getting, because the foundation they are building on is solid. Now, Marden also writes with tremendous insight about the nature of adversity and failure, and this is where the book really shows its depth, because he does not treat failure as a shameful thing to be avoided at all costs. He treats it as an inevitable and actually important part of the journey toward anything meaningful. He points out that virtually every person he studied who had achieved something remarkable had also failed, often spectacularly and repeatedly along the way. And he argues that this is not a coincidence, that the people who are willing to risk failure, to attempt hard things, to put themselves out there even when there is a real chance of falling down, are the same people who end up achieving significant things. Because you cannot accomplish anything significant without attempting things that might not work, and anything that might not work might sometimes not work. The question is not whether you will experience failure. You will. The question is what you do with it. And Marden is very clear about what the people who eventually succeed do with failure. They learn from it. They do not pretend it did not happen or dismiss it as someone else's fault. They look at it honestly, extract whatever lesson it contains, and use that lesson to do better next time. They treat failure not as an indictment of who they are, but as information about what they need to improve. He tells the story of a scientist who spent years trying to develop a particular process that he was convinced would work. He ran experiment after experiment. He documented each failure carefully. He adjusted his approach based on what each failure revealed. His colleagues grew impatient with what looked to them like endless futile effort. They could not understand why he kept going when so many attempts had produced nothing. And he said something that Marden quotes with obvious admiration. He said, "I have not failed 1,000 times. I have successfully identified 1,000 ways that do not work, and each one of those tells me something I needed to know." That reframe is extraordinarily powerful, because it changes the emotional relationship with failure completely. Instead of something that means you are inadequate, failure becomes something that means you are learning. It becomes a necessary step in the process rather than evidence that you should stop. Marden also writes about the danger of what he calls cheap success. The temptation to take shortcuts, to cut corners, to grab the easy win at the expense of what actually matters. And he is deeply suspicious of it, not because he is moralistic or puritanical about effort for its own sake, but because he observed again and again that cheap success does not hold. That the things built on shortcuts and compromises tend to fall apart, that the life constructed on a shaky foundation eventually reveals its instability, whereas the life built slowly, honestly, through genuine effort and real development of real skills and real character, has a solidity to it, a permanence. It does not crumble when conditions change, because it was not dependent on those conditions being favorable. It was built on something internal that goes with you wherever you go. This is connected to one of the chapters I find most compelling in the book, which is about the development of personal power. And by personal power, Marden does not mean the ability to dominate other people or accumulate resources for their own sake. He means the capacity to do things, to make things happen, to have a meaningful impact on the world around you. And he argues that this kind of power is not something that is handed to you or determined by your circumstances at birth. It is developed, deliberately over time, through the conscious cultivation of your abilities, your habits, your mindset, and your character. He is deeply interested in habit, and in how the habits we form literally shape the kind of person we become. Because a habit, at its core, is simply a behavior that has become automatic through repetition. And the remarkable thing about habits is that they do not feel like work once they are established. They just feel like what you do. So the person who has established the habit of reading and learning every day does not experience that as an effort. It just feels natural. The person who has established the habit of regular exercise does not feel like they are grinding themselves through something unpleasant. It is just Tuesday. And over time, these habits accumulate into a kind of compound interest in human form, each good habit making the next good thing slightly easier, each positive pattern reinforcing the others, until the person you have become is almost unrecognizable compared to who you were when you started. Marden tells the story of a man who wanted to develop greater self-discipline, but felt like he was a naturally impulsive, undisciplined person. He had tried to change before and failed, which had reinforced his belief that this was just who he was, and he was not capable of being any different. And Marden would say, that belief is the actual problem, not the impulsiveness, not the past failures, the belief that your current patterns are fixed. Because the science of habit tells us, and Marden observed this empirically in his time, that patterns of behavior are not fixed. They are learned, and what is learned can be unlearned and replaced with something better. The key is to start small, not to overhaul everything at once in a burst of enthusiasm that cannot possibly be sustained, but to choose one thing, one small, concrete, manageable habit, and commit to it completely, and then, once that is established, to add another and another, building slowly and surely, brick by brick, a different kind of life from the inside out. Now let us talk about something that might feel uncomfortable, because it has made a lot of people shift in their seats when Marden raises it. And that is the question of wasted time, because Marden is almost fierce on this subject. He believed that time is the most precious resource any person has, and that the careless, thoughtless squandering of it is one of the great tragedies of human life. Not because he thought every moment needed to be productive in some mechanical sense, but because he saw so clearly the gap between what people could accomplish with their time and what they actually accomplished, and that gap broke his heart a little. He talks about the hours that drain away in purposeless distraction, in conversations that go nowhere, in activities that produce neither rest nor growth nor joy, just a kind of deadening way of killing time before the day is over. And he contrasts this with the extraordinary amount that can be accomplished in even small pockets of focused, intentional time, when those pockets are used deliberately over months and years. He was particularly struck by the study of successful people and the discovery that most of them had periods in their lives when they had very little time available to pursue their goals. They had demanding jobs, family responsibilities, financial pressures. They were not in some ideal situation with unlimited free hours to build their dreams. And yet they used the time they did have with such intentionality and discipline that they accomplished things that people with far more free time never came close to. He tells the story of a young lawyer who was working extraordinarily long hours at a demanding firm, who was also raising young children, who had almost no free time by any conventional measure. And yet this man had decided that he was going to learn 3 new languages, not because it was required for his work, not because anyone was asking him to, but because he believed that expanding his mind and his capabilities in this way would make him a more interesting, more capable, more complete human being. And so every day, without exception, he spent 30 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes in the evening with his language studies, just 1 hour a day. And within 3 years, he had meaningful conversational ability in all 3 languages. People who heard this thought he must have some special gift for language. He did not. He just refused to let 1 hour a day disappear into nothingness. This is deeply encouraging if you let it be, because most people look at what they want to accomplish and think, I do not have the time. And Marden would say, find the hour. Maybe it is not a whole hour. Maybe it is 30 minutes. Maybe it is 20. But there is almost always something. And that something used consistently over years is not nothing. It is the difference between a life that grows and a life that stays still. At around the 10-minute mark of thinking through this remarkable book, you realize something important. This is not just a summary. This is an invitation to actually live differently, And before we continue, if this is landing for you, if you are feeling something stirring as you hear these ideas, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear exactly this kind of content. Every like, every subscription, it matters more than you might think, and it keeps this work alive. So thank you, truly, for that. Now let us keep going, because we are only partway through and the best ideas are still ahead. Marden writes with extraordinary passion about the concept of opportunity, and his perspective on it is not what most people expect. Because most people think of opportunity as something external, something that happens to you or does not happen to you, based on luck and circumstances beyond your control. And Marden takes that idea and essentially turns it inside out. He argues that opportunity, for the most part, is not found, it is created. And it is created through preparation, through showing up consistently, through developing the skills and the relationships and the reputation that cause opportunities to flow toward you rather than away from you. He uses a famous phrase that has been quoted countless times since: opportunity knocks at every person's door. The question is whether you are awake and ready when it knocks. Because opportunity rarely arrives announced and obvious. It often looks like hard work. It often looks like a problem that someone needs solved. It often looks like a small opening that most people overlook because they are waiting for something bigger and more obvious. The people who catch these moments, who recognize the small opening and move through it quickly, are not luckier than everyone else. They are more prepared. They have been developing their capabilities and their awareness so consistently that when a moment arrives, they are ready to take it. He tells the story of a young man who was working as a clerk in a department store, a job that most people around him considered beneath their ambitions. Most of the clerks did their work adequately and spent their downtime complaining about the job and dreaming about something better. This young man did something different. He treated every aspect of his job as an opportunity to learn. He studied how the business ran. He paid attention to what customers wanted and were not getting. He thought about how things could be done better. He made himself useful in ways that went well beyond what was expected of him. And when the store owner was looking for someone to take on more responsibility, there was only one name that came to mind. Not because this young man was more talented than his colleagues, but because he was the only one who had been paying attention and showing up at a higher level than required. That phrase, higher level than required, is one of the most important in this whole book, because Marden believed deeply that the person who consistently gives more than what is strictly required is building something that cannot be taken away. A reputation, a set of skills, a pattern of behavior that will, sooner or later, open doors that were previously closed. He is also deeply interested in the concept of adding value, not in the modern marketing sense, but in the most fundamental sense, of genuinely making things better, of being the kind of person whose presence in any situation, any team, any organization, any relationship, leaves things better than they were before. And he argues that this orientation, this genuine desire to contribute and improve, is one of the most reliable paths to a meaningful and successful life. Because the world will always need people who make things better. There will never be a shortage of demand for that. Let us spend some time with what Marden says about reading and continuous learning, because this is another area where he is almost evangelical. He grew up with very little formal education and taught himself through books. He had seen firsthand what reading and learning could do for a person who applied it seriously. And he believed that the person who stops learning has essentially stopped growing. That the mind, like any other capacity, either develops or atrophies based on how you use it. He talks about the difference between people who read casually and people who read with purpose, who approach a book not just as entertainment, but as a source of genuine insight and knowledge that they are going to integrate into how they think and act, who read with a pencil in hand, marking the things that strike them as important, returning to those passages, sitting with ideas long enough to actually absorb them, rather than just moving on to the next thing. He was particularly passionate about biography, about the lives of people who had accomplished remarkable things, because he believed that reading deeply about the lives of exceptional people does something to your own sense of what is possible. It expands your sense of the range of human experience and human achievement. It shows you that the people who shaped history were not fundamentally different creatures from you. They were people, with fears and doubts and failures and confusing periods where they could not see the way forward, and they found a way anyway. And seeing that clearly, really seeing it, does something to your own sense of what you might be capable of. He also writes about the importance of learning from people who are where you want to be, of actively seeking out mentors, advisors, examples, not in a passive hoping someone will take you under their wing kind of way, but actively, deliberately, with genuine curiosity and humility, asking the people who have done what you want to do, how did you do it? What do you know now that you wish you had known at the beginning? What mistakes did you make that I should try to avoid? And then actually listening to the answers, not just waiting for a gap in the conversation to talk about yourself, but genuinely absorbing what you are hearing and letting it change how you think and act. There is a beautiful section in Pushing to the Front about what Marden calls the magnetic quality of the prepared mind. He describes how people who have developed real knowledge and real capability in their area seem to attract opportunities and recognition almost effortlessly. And his explanation is not mystical, it is practical. When you genuinely know your field deeply, it shows in everything you do and say. It shows in the quality of your questions. It shows in the confidence with which you handle problems. It shows in the ideas you offer, and other people respond to that depth in a way they cannot always articulate. They just know that this person knows what they are talking about. This person has something real to offer, and they want to work with that person, invest in that person, recommend that person. The preparation creates the magnetism. This connects to something Marden writes about with great passion, which is the idea of genuine excellence, of not settling for good enough when better is possible, of caring enough about your work, whatever your work is, to pursue mastery rather than adequacy. He was deeply frustrated by the tendency he observed in many people to do just enough to get by, to produce work that was acceptable but not exceptional, and then to wonder why their careers were not progressing, or why they were not experiencing the kind of recognition and opportunity that they felt they deserved. He says quite directly, the world gives its best to those who give their best to the world. This sounds like a platitude until you sit with it, because what it means, practically, is that excellence is not just a moral virtue. It is a strategy. The person who consistently produces work of the highest quality they are capable of is sending a signal with every piece of work, every interaction, every deliverable. And that signal compounds over time into a reputation that becomes one of the most valuable things a person can possess. He tells the story of two architects who started their careers at roughly the same time, with roughly the same level of talent and training. Within 10 years, their careers were in completely different places. The first architect had established a reputation for delivering beautiful, thoughtful, meticulously executed work. His clients raved about him. His projects won recognition. Other firms wanted to collaborate with him. The second architect had built a reputation for delivering work that was fine, acceptable, on time and within budget, but without any particular distinction. His clients were satisfied but not enthusiastic, and in a field where most work comes from reputation and referral, satisfied but not enthusiastic turned out to be a significant limitation. The difference was not talent. The first architect simply cared more about quality. He spent more time on each project. He asked harder questions about what each client truly needed. He revised his work more willingly when he felt it was not yet right. He held himself to a higher standard than anyone outside was requiring of him, and that internal standard, applied consistently over years, created a completely different career. Marden also addresses the social dimensions of success with great insight. He is very clear that success is rarely a solo achievement, that the ability to work well with others, to build genuine relationships, to earn trust and loyalty, to bring out the best in the people around you is essential. Not just nice to have, essential. He talks about the kind of person that other people want to help, who seems to generate goodwill and support almost naturally. And he identifies the qualities that produce this effect: genuine interest in other people, consistency and reliability, generosity with knowledge and assistance, the ability to make other people feel valued and seen. These are not manipulative tactics. They are the natural expressions of a person who genuinely cares about the people around them and shows it consistently. And the remarkable thing about genuine caring is that it tends to come back to you in ways you could never have planned or engineered. He contrasts this with a person who is fundamentally transactional in their relationships, who is warm and interested when they need something from you and distant when they do not, who gives credit grudgingly and takes it readily, who treats people primarily as means to an end. And Marden observes that while this approach can produce short-term results, it almost always limits long-term success, because people are perceptive. They may not be able to articulate it, but they sense when they are being used. And they stop being generous with someone who is only generous when they want something. The genuinely successful people Marden studied were almost universally described by the people around them as someone you want to see succeed. There was a generosity of spirit in them, a genuine desire for others to do well, that created an environment of mutual support and goodwill, and that environment produced results that no individual could have created alone. There is a wonderful section on what Marden calls moral courage, and this is different from physical courage, though he admires that too. Moral courage is the courage to stand by your convictions when it would be easier and more socially comfortable to go along with the crowd. To say what you actually think when everyone around you is saying something different, to make the decision you know is right even when it is unpopular, to refuse to compromise your integrity even when the pressure to do so is significant. He observed that many people had genuinely good values and sound judgment, but lacked the courage to act on them when it cost them something. They would privately know that a decision was wrong but stay silent to avoid conflict. They would privately disagree with the direction a group was taking but vote with the majority to fit in. They would make small compromises to avoid disapproval, and then slightly larger ones, until over time they had drifted so far from their own convictions that they could barely remember what those convictions had been. He tells the story of a young executive who was in a meeting where a decision was being made that he was convinced was ethically problematic. Every other person in the room seemed to be going along with it. The pressure to do the same was enormous, and he stood up and said, "I cannot support this. Here is why." And then he made his case, clearly and honestly, even though he could see the irritation on the faces of his superiors. The decision was ultimately changed, and the people who had been irritated in the moment came later to respect him deeply for it, because they knew that this was a person who would tell them the truth, who would say the hard thing, who could be trusted to give his honest assessment rather than just telling people what they wanted to hear. That kind of trust, the trust that comes from knowing a person will be honest with you even when it is difficult, is extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily valuable. And it is built through exactly these small moments of moral courage, accumulated over time. Marden writes with great wisdom about the relationship between work and rest. He was not advocating for the kind of relentless grinding that destroys health and relationships and creativity. He understood that the mind and body need genuine recovery, that sustained high performance is only possible with real rest, that the person who never stops is not more productive than the person who works intensely and then genuinely switches off. In fact, quite the opposite. The person who never rests eventually reaches a state of diminished capacity where they are putting in the hours but not producing the results. Whereas the person who manages their energy wisely, who works hard and rests fully, tends to sustain both quality and capacity over time. He talks about the importance of activities that restore and replenish the spirit. Whatever those are for you, time in nature, music, time with people you love, physical movement, prayer or contemplation or whatever practice connects you to something larger than your immediate concerns. He saw these not as frivolous indulgences that distracted from serious work, but as essential maintenance for the kind of sustained effort that serious work requires. This is something that the most effective people intuitively understand, but that the culture of busyness often pushes against. The idea that rest and restoration are not lazy. They are strategic. They are part of the process. And the person who takes them seriously tends to perform at a higher level over the long run than the person who treats every waking moment as an opportunity to squeeze in more productivity. There is also a deeply moving section of pushing to the front about the importance of service, of orienting your life not just toward personal achievement, but toward contribution, toward making the world, or at least your corner of it, a better place. And Marden was not naive about this. He understood that people have bills to pay and families to support and very practical concerns that cannot be waved away in a cloud of idealism. But he believed, and the evidence of the lives he studied strongly suggested, that the people who find the deepest satisfaction and the most enduring success are the ones who have found a way to connect their work to something they genuinely care about, some larger purpose beyond personal gain. He tells the story of a doctor who had a very successful practice by any external measure, good income, respected in the community, technically proficient, and yet he felt hollow, empty, like he was going through the motions of a successful life without actually living one. And the turning point came when he started volunteering at a clinic in an underserved neighborhood, seeing patients who had no access to the kind of care they needed. His technical skills were the same, his intelligence was the same, but something about doing that work, knowing that it genuinely mattered to people who had nowhere else to turn, ignited something in him that transformed everything, including, eventually, his paid practice, which became more meaningful to him once he had reconnected with the reason he had gone into medicine in the first place. Purpose is not something that most people find all at once, in some dramatic moment of clarity. It is usually something that reveals itself gradually, through paying attention to what moves you, what angers you about injustice in the world, what you find yourself drawn to even when there is no obvious reward for it. And Marden encourages his readers to take those signals seriously, not to dismiss them as impractical or indulgent, because they are pointing towards something real about who you are and what you are capable of contributing. Now let us talk about some of the more specific practical wisdom that Marden offers, because the book is not all philosophy and story. There are concrete, actionable ideas throughout, and they are worth spending time with. On the subject of speech and communication, Marden is emphatic that the ability to express yourself clearly, compellingly, and with confidence is one of the most valuable skills a person can develop. He observed that many people with sound ideas and genuine competence were held back because they could not articulate their thoughts effectively. They would mumble and qualify and trail off. They would use 10 words where 3 would do. They would be unable to hold the attention of the room or to make their case with the clarity and conviction it deserved. And he believed that this was entirely learnable, that the ability to speak and write well is a skill like any other that responds to practice and attention. He talked about the importance of precision in language, of choosing words that say exactly what you mean, rather than approximate approximations that leave your meaning fuzzy, of being willing to revise and refine until what comes out of your mouth or off your pen actually represents what you are trying to communicate, and of developing comfort with silence, with the pause, with taking a moment to think before speaking rather than filling every moment with sound just to avoid the discomfort of stillness. He also writes about the power of listening, real listening, not the kind where you are waiting for your turn to talk, but the kind where you are actually trying to understand what the other person is saying and feeling. He observed that the most effective communicators were almost always excellent listeners, not because listening is passive, but because deep listening allows you to respond to what someone is actually saying rather than what you assumed they were going to say. And responding to what someone is actually saying rather than your assumption of what they are saying produces completely different conversations and completely different outcomes. On the subject of finances and building material security, Marden is careful and practical. He does not tell people to despise money or treat it as beneath consideration. He treats it as a tool, and like any tool, its value depends entirely on how you use it. He is deeply concerned with the habit of living beyond your means, of spending more than you earn, of treating debt as a normal and permanent feature of life rather than an emergency that needs to be addressed. And he talks about the slow, quiet power of saving, of the compound effect of consistently spending less than you earn and allowing the surplus to accumulate and grow. He tells the story of 2 men who earned similar incomes throughout their working lives. One of them lived fully up to his income, enjoying the lifestyle that money could buy, but never managing to accumulate anything beyond what the next paycheck provided. The other lived modestly and saved and invested consistently, never dramatically, never sacrificing comfort for parsimony, but also never spending money just because it was there to spend. At the end of their working lives, these 2 men were in completely different positions. One was dependent on continuing to work because stopping would mean financial difficulty. The other had choices. He could work if he wanted to, or stop if he wanted to, or transition to something different. He had options because he had been disciplined over decades with something as simple and unglamorous as not spending every dollar he earned. This is not exciting advice. It is not the kind of thing that goes viral or makes people feel inspired in the moment. But Marden believed in telling people the truth even when the truth was mundane, because mundane truths consistently applied produce real results in ways that exciting shortcuts almost never do. He also addresses the danger of comparison, of measuring your progress against other people rather than against your own potential and previous position, because comparison is almost always a trap. Either you compare yourself to someone who is further along than you and feel inadequate, which is discouraging, or you compare yourself to someone who is behind you and feel complacent, which is equally destructive in a different way. The only comparison that actually serves you is comparing who you are today to who you were yesterday, last month, last year. Are you growing? Are you learning? Are you becoming more capable, more skilled, more grounded? That is the measure that matters. He writes movingly about the concept of persistence, about the quality that he saw over and over in the people who achieved remarkable things, not brilliance, not genius, not the most favorable circumstances. Persistence, the willingness to keep going when it would be perfectly reasonable to stop, the refusal to accept temporary setback as permanent failure, the ability to get up one more time than you have been knocked down. He tells the story of a writer who submitted his first novel to 37 publishers before the 38th said yes. 37 rejections. Most people would have stopped at 5, maybe 10 if they were unusually resilient. This writer kept a notebook where he recorded each rejection and what, if anything, he had learned from the feedback. He revised and improved the manuscript. He remained absolutely convinced that the work was worth publishing even when 37 professional judgments said otherwise. And the 38th publisher who said yes did not do so out of charity. He said yes because the manuscript was genuinely good, and it was as good as it was, in part because of everything the writer had learned from those previous 37 experiences. That story is extreme but not unusual in the history of literature, or business, or science, or any other domain where great things have been accomplished. The pattern of persistent effort in the face of repeated rejection is so common among people who eventually achieve something significant that Marden found it impossible to view it as coincidence. It is almost as if the universe tests you, as if the path to anything worthwhile passes through the territory of wanting to give up and choosing not to. One of the most interesting aspects of this book is Marden's treatment of what he calls the psychology of success. He was ahead of his time in recognizing that achievement is not purely an external process, that it has an internal dimension that is just as important as any external factor, that the way you think about yourself, about what you are capable of, about what is possible, shapes what you actually attempt and therefore what you actually achieve. He talks about the power of what we would today call a growth mindset, the belief that your capabilities are not fixed, that intelligence and talent are not static quantities that you either have or do not have, but capacities that can be developed through effort and experience. And he contrasts this with what he saw as the limiting belief that some people are just naturally gifted and others are not, and that the best you can do with what you have been given is try to use it well. He believed that most people significantly underestimate what they are capable of, that the actual ceiling of human potential in any given person is almost always higher than the person believes, and that the gap between what someone could do and what they are doing is often not a gap in talent or intelligence or opportunity, but a gap in belief, in what they have decided is possible for them. He tells a story about a man who had spent years convinced that he had no aptitude for mathematics. He had struggled with it in school, received poor grades, been told by teachers that it was simply not his strength, and had internalized all of this as a fixed and permanent truth about himself. And then, in his 40s, he was required by a career change to develop some basic mathematical skills, and something unexpected happened. With a good teacher and a genuine need and a willingness to approach the subject without the weight of all his previous failure stories, he discovered that he could do it. Not effortlessly, not brilliantly, but competently. In fact, well enough to build an entirely new professional competency on top of it. What changed? Not his brain. His belief and his approach. He stopped treating it as a verdict on who he was and started treating it as a skill he was developing. And that shift unlocked something that all those years of believing he could not do it had kept locked away. This does not mean that Marden believed everyone is equally capable of everything. He was not being naive about real differences in natural aptitude, but he believed that the average person's actual potential in any given area is far higher than they have been led to believe or than they have tested, and that the most common barrier to discovering that potential is the willingness to put in the effort to find out. Marden also writes with great care about the importance of taking care of your health, not as an aesthetic concern, but as a practical one. He understood that your physical state directly affects your mental state, your energy levels, your emotional resilience, your capacity for sustained effort. And he observed that the people who consistently performed at high levels over long periods of time almost universally took their health seriously, not obsessively, not to the exclusion of everything else, but as a fundamental infrastructure of their capacity to do everything else they wanted to do. He talks about the importance of sleep, of adequate physical movement, of eating in a way that sustains rather than depletes your energy, of taking care of your body, not because vanity demands it, but because everything you want to accomplish depends on the functioning of the instrument through which you accomplish it. And in a time when he was writing, when the connection between physical well-being and mental and professional performance was much less well understood than it is today, this was genuinely forward-thinking. He also writes about the danger of stimulants and anything that promises to extend performance artificially at the cost of genuine recovery. He was suspicious of anything that seemed to produce energy through debt rather than through genuine replenishment. And his reasoning was straightforward. You cannot sustainably borrow energy from the future. Every shortcut you take in how you treat your body eventually presents a bill. And the longer the bill goes unpaid, the more severe the consequences. As we move toward the later chapters of this book, Marden begins to write about what might be called the larger vision of a life well lived. Not just success in any narrow professional sense, but the full expression of what a human being is capable of when they are living with purpose, with integrity, with genuine engagement with the world around them. He talks about what he calls the aristocracy of achievement, the idea that the true measure of a person is not their birth, not their wealth, not their social position, but what they have made of what they were given, what they have contributed, what they have created, what difference their presence on earth has made. And he argues that this kind of aristocracy is genuinely available to anyone who is willing to do the work of developing themselves and committing to giving their best. He was moved, throughout his life, by the examples of people who had started with the least and built the most, not in material terms necessarily, though sometimes in those terms too, but in terms of character, capability, contribution, and impact. People who had refused to be defined by their circumstances and had instead defined themselves through their choices and their effort. And he wanted desperately for his readers to see themselves in those examples, to understand that those people were not a different species. They were ordinary people who had made an extraordinary decision to refuse the ordinary path. He writes about the man who decides at 40 that his life has not yet begun in any meaningful sense, who looks at the years behind him and feels not grief but a kind of fierce resolve, who decides that whatever time remains will be lived differently, more intentionally, more fully, and who discovers, to his amazement, that 40% is not too late, that 60% is not too late, that as long as there is breath and will, the possibility of meaningful growth and contribution and change remains alive, because what Marden understood, and what he wanted everyone who read his book to understand, is that the story is not over until it is over. And even the most stuck, most delayed, most apparently hopeless situation contains within it the seed of something better, if the person is willing to do the work of nurturing it. There is something in Marden's writing about gratitude that deserves mention. He was not the kind of person who wallowed in hardship. He had experienced profound hardship. He had lost everything more than once. He had faced rejection and failure and the kind of discouragement that would have silenced most people. And yet there is a quality of warmth and appreciation in his writing that suggests a genuine love of life and of the possibilities it contains. He seemed to approach the world with a fundamental sense of wonder and gratitude for the opportunity to be in it and to try. He believed that this orientation, this fundamental appreciation for the gift of being alive and the opportunity to do something with that life, was itself a source of energy and resilience. that the person who is genuinely grateful has a different relationship with difficulty than the person who feels cheated by it. The grateful person can see the hard thing as part of a larger story that is worth living. The bitter person sees it as further proof that the universe is against them, and that difference in perception produces an almost completely different experience of the same life. He tells the story of a woman who had lost her husband and one of her children in a single terrible year, by any measure, a devastating set of circumstances. And she did grieve. She did go through the darkness. She would not have been human if she had not. But on the other side of that grief, she made a choice that Marden found extraordinary. She chose to be grateful, not to deny the loss or to pretend it had not happened, but to be genuinely grateful for the time she had had, for the love that had been real, for the children who were still with her, for the life that was still there to be lived. And this choice, maintained daily, even on the days when it did not come easily, produced a quality of resilience and presence in her that struck everyone who knew her. She was not defined by her tragedy. She was shaped by it, deepened by it, but not destroyed by it. And the key was the daily, conscious, sometimes difficult choice of gratitude. This is not naive positivity. Marden was not telling people to pretend that bad things are good or that pain is not real. He was saying that the practice of finding what is genuinely good, genuinely worth appreciating, genuinely worthy of acknowledgement, even in difficult circumstances, is not a denial of reality. It is an act of will, a choice about where to direct your attention, and where you direct your attention shapes your experience of your life more than almost any other single factor. Let us talk about something that Marden addresses with a kind of quiet insistence, which is the question of reputation, not in the sense of managing how people perceive you, which is ultimately a hollow and exhausting game, but in the sense of the natural byproduct of how you actually are, the reputation that accrues over years and decades to the person who is consistently reliable, consistently honest, consistently generous with their abilities and their time. He talks about reputation as a kind of living recommendation, as the thing that walks into a room before you do and says something about who you are and what you can be counted on to do. And he argues that this kind of reputation cannot be built through clever self-presentation or strategic networking. It can only be built through actually being the person you want to be known as, day after day, in small moments and large ones, when it is convenient and when it is not. He tells the story of a young woman who is new to a city and new to a profession. She had no existing network, no family connections in the industry, no obvious advantages. What she had was a commitment to showing up fully and doing excellent work and treating every person she encountered with genuine respect and interest, regardless of their position or apparent usefulness to her. Within 3 years, she had built a reputation in her field that senior people with decades of experience did not have, not because she was more talented, because she had understood, from the beginning, that the reputation you build day by day is the most valuable professional asset you will ever have. As we approach the final chapters of this magnificent book, Marden turns to what might be his most personal and most universal theme. The idea that each person has a unique contribution to make, a specific way in which they are suited to add to the world that no one else can add in quite the same way. And that the discovery and expression of this contribution is not just a path to personal success, but the deepest purpose of a human life. He was not speaking in mystical terms. He was speaking practically. He observed that the people who found the most satisfaction in their lives, and who also, often, made the most significant contributions to the world, were the ones who had found work that aligned with their deepest nature. Not perfect alignment, not a magical job where every moment was bliss, but a genuine match between what they were doing and what they were fundamentally built for. And he believed that this match for most people is discoverable, not through passive waiting, but through active exploration and honest self-examination. He encourages his readers to pay attention to where they feel most alive, to notice what subjects they find themselves returning to, regardless of whether anyone is asking them to observe what kinds of problems they are drawn to solving, what kinds of needs in the world they feel personally affected by. These signals, taken seriously and followed with some courage and some practical planning, tend to lead towards something meaningful. He acknowledges, with his usual directness, that not everyone can immediately abandon their current work and pursue their ideal. Most people have responsibilities that require them to be practical, But he says quite firmly that even within practical constraints, there are choices. There are ways to move in the direction of what matters to you, even if the movement is slow. There are ways to develop the skills and the experience that will eventually allow a transition. There are ways to find meaning in what you are currently doing while you build towards something better. And the people who refuse to look for these ways, who use practical constraints as a reason for total inaction, are making a choice. They may not see it as a choice, but it is. The closing message of Pushing to the Front is essentially a call to arms, a passionate, urgent invitation to stop waiting for life to begin and to recognize that it has already begun, that the time is now, that the capacity for growth and change and meaningful achievement does not expire, that the world is genuinely in need of what you have to offer, whatever that is, and that the only person who can decide to step up and offer it is you. Marden lived what he wrote. He rebuilt himself from the ashes more than once. He kept going when stopping would have been perfectly understandable. He chose every single day to push forward rather than accept limitation as permanent. And the book he wrote is not just a collection of ideas. It is the distilled wisdom of a life fully lived by a man who refused to be small. There is something that happens when you really engage with this book. Not just skim it or absorb it passively, but truly sit with it and let it speak to the parts of you that already know it is right. Something shifts, not dramatically, maybe, not all at once, but something, a quiet recalibration, a renewed sense that your life is not yet written, that the next chapter is still in your hands, that all those things you have been meaning to do and meaning to be and meaning to become are not lost. They are waiting, and the only thing standing between you and them is the decision to start pushing forward. Because that is ultimately what this book is about. Not about being the most successful person in any competitive sense, not about crushing your opponents or acquiring the most, but about becoming the fullest version of yourself that you are capable of becoming. About living with such intention and such effort and such genuine engagement that when your life is over, you will know that you gave it what it deserved, that you did not coast, that you did not waste it, that you pushed. Orison Swett Marden believed that in every ordinary life there is the seed of something extraordinary, and all it needs, all it has ever needed, is someone willing to tend it, someone willing to push through the difficulty and the doubt and the endless small discouragements that the world throws at anyone who dares to try for something more. Someone willing to be that person, not later, not when conditions are perfect, not when they feel ready, but now, with what they have, from where they are. And maybe, just maybe, that someone is you. If this has moved something in you, if you found yourself nodding along or feeling that fire flicker back to life somewhere inside you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. Your support is what makes it possible to keep bringing content like this to the people who need it most. Every like, every subscription, every comment telling us what resonated, it matters enormously. It keeps the lights on and the voices speaking. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being here and for listening all the way through. And while you are here, please take a moment to browse our channel. We have a whole library of audiobooks and summaries covering some of the most powerful, life-changing books ever written. Books on mindset, on business, on relationships, on history, on science, on the full range of human experience and human potential. Whether you are looking for something to inspire you on a hard day, or something to challenge how you think, or something that will simply keep you company on a long drive or a morning walk, you will find it there. Check out our videos and find what calls to you next, because the next book you read might be the one that changes everything, just like this one might have. Keep pushing. Keep growing. The front is closer than you think.